Thank you, Emily. Greetings to all our members and guests. Welcome to today's webinar, Transforming Site Identification and Site Selection. I'm Josh Hollingsy. I head the Transylvania Economic Alliance in Brevard and chair NCDA's Professional Development Committee. It's my duty to kick things off this morning. We live in times of rapid change, and economic developers are not immune from dramatic shifts in the way businesses are planning for the future. COVID-19 has accelerated many of the changes already underway with regard to real estate. One of our key challenges is to find solutions to quickly and cost-effectively identify developable sites that are attractive in an uncertain market. The good news is there are new tools available to help us do this. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment and introduce and thank Joe Starr and his colleagues at Terracon for their support in presenting this important topic to our members. We appreciate the company's technical expertise and commitment to NCDA's professional development programs. Please also take a look at your screen now as Emily shares the names and logos of all the NCDA annual sponsors. These companies and organizations stand with NCDA and its members in good times and not so good times, and their generosity supports our mission year-round. Our sincere thanks go out to all our annual sponsors. Joe Starr, our moderator today, is a professional engineer with Terracon in Raleigh, where he works as client development manager. In his 25-year career as an environmental engineering consultant, he has helped clients understand and manage risk in a way that aligns with their business objectives, and his expertise spans transportation, power generation, manufacturing, government, and other sectors. And with that, Joe, I'd like to introduce you and turn this presentation over to you.
Josh, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thanks to everybody for being here today. Josh really hit it on the head. You know, it is a very fast-paced economy that we're dealing with, and one that's been really challenged by COVID in particular. And so now, you know, it's more important than ever that we find ways to sort of take that data that we have and figure out a way to make smarter decisions, especially when you're dealing with fierce competition and tight budgets. Whether you're in a tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 county, you're dealing with the similar challenges. You know, maybe you have a limited budget to sort of figure out which sites you should put forth for attracting that particular client, or the pace of change and the need for schedule is so fast that you need to make decisions even quicker and earlier than before. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. You know, how do we transform that site identification and site selection process to make it faster and smarter as we move forward? I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers today. First and foremost is going to be Tess Fay. Tess is a senior consultant with Global Location Strategies. And what makes Tess unique for this topic in particular is that she understands the site selection side. She's been there, she's done that, she's helped companies find sites all over the country. So she knows what companies are looking for in a site. But she also understands the economic development side. And she understands the challenges and pressures that you're all facing, and the fact that we need to be able to take this portfolio of sites and sort of narrow it down to something that is not just developable, but desirable too. And after Tess sort of goes through the presentation of how GLS is helping us do site identification better, Mike Frawley is going to join us. Mike is a senior geotechnical engineer with Terracon. He's been in the business for over 15 years. And what makes Mike unique is that he also has a background in environmental engineering and civil construction. So he really understands the challenges that we need to face when doing development of particular properties. That background really set Mike up nicely several years ago to take over the technical leadership for Terracon Stage 1 tool. And he's working on this tool and these projects all over the country. So he's got a really deep background and knowledge of this particular service line. And many of you may remember Mike from the annual meeting a year ago in Beaufort. It's crazy to think that it was just a year ago that we were in Beaufort, but It was a year ago that Mike introduced stage one and was focused on the geotechnical aspects of what we can do to help you on the site selection process. But what I'm really excited about today is to help you sort of peer behind the curtain and see how this is done, but also to be able to unveil the environmental aspects that have now been incorporated into this tool. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and shift it over to Tess. Tess?
Yes, good morning. Let me get the technology piece figured out here. All right, you all should be able to see my screen now. So thank you for having me. I'm glad to talk with you all today. And thank you for the introduction. My name is Tess Fay. I'm a senior consultant with Global Location Strategies. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about how we at GLS are leveraging technology to, as Joe said, efficiently and effectively identify sites for our site selection projects. And I'm going to walk you through how you can use similar tools and methodologies to identify future industrial sites in your region. Really quick overview of Global Location Strategies. So we are a site selection firm. About 75% of our business is working with corporations and helping them to evaluate their expansion plans. We are best known for our heavy industrial projects, but over the past several years, we have gone through some diversification. So we work anywhere in the realm of general manufacturing and distribution, all the way up to those heaviest and most complicated projects. So I said about 75% on the corporate side. That other 25% of our business is working with economic development organizations and regional groups. And those are very targeted and strategic engagements, really the sorts of services where we feel like our background in site selection can be best leveraged to help the economic developers that we're working with. So that's primarily helping to assess specific assets like brownfield sites and other unique properties, and guiding those through the target industry identification and redevelopment process, and then also site identification to help communities develop a pipeline of sites. So when we're talking with economic developers, there tend to be 4 primary keys that we identify as being really vital to successful recruitment of industry into your community. So the first is to compete on costs. We work with communities to help them understand their cost structures and where they will be most competitive. We also work with them to ready their workforce. Third, and what we're going to talk about today is building the inventory of sites and buildings. And then fourth, aligning your team, which is such a vital piece of this overall strategy. But as I said, today we're really going to focus on how you build your inventory and how you identify sites that can be strong assets for your community. And the reason why this is so important is because you can be the best community with the best workforce and the best cost structure, but at the end of the day, if you don't have the right site or building for a project, you can't be considered in that site selection process. So let's think quickly about the life cycle of a site. So at the very day one of site identification, we are going out. You want to identify the parcels that could be advantageous to the sort of use or user who you're going to be trying to recruit. And you take that parcel through a series of evaluations. You continue to elevate the site through a due diligence process, through an acquisition or obtaining a purchase option. And then you get to the point where you're ready to market that site. Of course, the final goal is that you will successfully recruit a company to locate on that site. That's a great news that we all like hearing about. But what we see far too often is that communities will take a site through the first 3 phases of this life cycle, get it to the marketing phase, and then they'll still remain exclusively focused on that property and the marketing of it. And while it's important that you continue to pay attention to that site, continue to advance it towards even more investment readiness, you also need to be thinking about what the replacement site is going to be when that property has a project landed on it. So really, we want to help you not become a victim of your own success. We see communities who will land a project on that site they've been marketing, but then they're out of the game for a couple of years while they're trying to identify the site and take it back through this process to get it back to the marketing phase. So we really recommend as soon as you get a site to the marketing phase, that's when you need to start identifying the replacement for that site. So we like to think about site identification as really an inversion of the site selection process. So the goal that you have is to identify properties that would be attractive to a project if it was put through a site selection process. And you, as an economic developer, want to make it easy for a future project to say yes to your site. And so when you are going through the site identification process, you have the luxury of being able to think through all of the attraction criteria, detraction criteria, and really cater to the strengths of your community, leverage those strengths to identify the sites that would be most attractive to your target use types. So we're going to talk through each of these steps in a little bit more detail, but as a bit of additional background, so GLS has two interests in the site identification process. So first, our clients, as I said, tend to be bigger, more complex, and the sort of sites that we need don't exist everywhere. So we have had plenty of instances where our client needs to be in a certain region and have a certain type of site with more exotic siting requirements, and that site just doesn't exist where we need it to. And so on the one hand, we'll work through that site identification process. We call it off-market site identification on behalf of our corporate clients to help them find the combination of assets that they need. On the other hand, though, we're also able to leverage this, very similar process of reversing the site selection methodology to help regions of economic development organizations identify their pipeline of future sites and help them to prioritize how they should be spending their precious resources of time, money, and political capital. So when we were thinking about how we could best accomplish these goals of identifying future successful sites, we thought about the wealth of data that we have available through our different technology platforms, and really specifically within our GIS platform that we use. So you can see I just put a few maps up here of some of the many different layers that we have available to us. And as we were thinking about this, we ended up about over a year ago to develop a series of heat maps that combined all of that rich data to help us invert the site selection process so that we could quickly and efficiently identify the regions and then the actual parcels that would be best suited for specific industry use types. So we've incorporated a significant amount of data into these heat maps, including regional characteristics, site characteristics, logistics infrastructure, workforce data, and we're now using this technology tool to help us understand where we would receive, which regions and which parcels would receive high scores if we put them through our site selection methodology for a specific type of use. So I put a couple of maps up here just so you can see what the heat maps look like. This specifically, I believe, is our heavy industrial rail dependent heat map that I've incorporated here on the slide. And like I said, we're actively using these heat maps both for corporate site selection projects, but then also to help communities identify their target areas of focus for site identification. So I'm going to walk you through some of the major considerations that went into the development of these heat maps over the past year. And I think that this should help you identify what you need to keep top of mind as you go through a similar process internally. So if we go, back to this funnel and think first about the attraction criteria, so the type of site that we want to identify. We first need to think about the region where you're going to look for that site. So we recommend that you work regionally at a minimum as you go through this process so that you're able to leverage the strengths of each individual community. So for instance, maybe one community has a dense population center. That's where your workforce is going to come from. That's where your bigger amenities are going to be located. But then maybe the community next door to that has the abundance of land or infrastructure that a project's going to need. So by partnering together as a region at the beginning of the site identification process, you're able to really assess the benefits of that entire region, identify the product gaps within the entire region, and work forward through the site identification methodology in a much more productive and successful way. So next, we want to think about what our target industries and target use types are. So this is how we at GLS decide which heat map we're going to use. So again, throughout this presentation, I've included some screenshots that show our heavy industrial rail dependent heat map, but depending on the type of site that we're looking for, we would adjust which map we're going to use because each of those heat maps considers different aspects that would be either vital or attractive to that type of project. But so when you're doing this as a region, you can think about if your target users are going to need a single large pad, if they need to be located in a high-tech industrial park, and that's going to help you begin to think through the sorts of parcels that you're going out and looking for. So next, and along the same lines, you're going to want to think about how you can leverage your strengths as a community and as a region. Again, this is really how we built the heat maps, is thinking through these attraction criteria and then what we've called the detraction criteria for a specific type of user. So think about, what the strengths are in your region. If you have interstate running through, if you've got rail lines running through, maybe you have really abundant utilities of one sort of another. Maybe you have certain industry concentrations or skill set concentrations. And as you think about those strengths, you should be trying to identify how you can really leverage those strengths in the parcels that you identify to advance through the site identification process. So you can see here, one of the sites that we've identified for an economic development organization is adjacent to the interstate on one side, adjacent to the rail side on the other side, and actually, hopefully you can see my mouse, but just to the northeast of this property is a major manufacturing OEM. And so from an industry concentration standpoint, this was a really great location as well. So once you've gone through and thought about all of those things that you want to be close to, the next step is to begin narrowing down your potential sites by thinking about the things that you don't want to be close to. This is going to vary, again, completely based upon what type of user you're targeting and what they are going to specifically see as negatives if they take your site through the site selection process. So first, I want to think about what your neighbors look like. So here's an example. We have a parcel that we identified for an economic development client. This was a single landowner, so a really sizable piece of land. And as you can see, it's got a lot of great attributes as highlighted by the heat map there and how green that site is. So when we started to look at this, though, we then took a quick look at the neighbors surrounding the site that could, for potential or for certain project types, be considered detractors. So here is a school that's located pretty darn close to this potential site. However, upon further evaluation, the school is actually located right next to existing industrial operations. So maybe less of a concern than we initially thought. It is interesting to point out that we built this sort of consideration into our heat map. So there's a little white spot where that school is located in the heat map where it said, you know, nope, you can't locate right here, there's a school. We also took a look at the fact that there's this residential neighborhood adjacent to the site. Again, the heat map has eliminated that from the model, and that's because of population density and those little parcels that suggest that was probably a neighborhood. So again, heat map saying, nope, that's something that we don't want to focus on. Again, though, in this case, this neighborhood is also right next to an existing industrial operation, and it's also separated from the potential site by this 4-lane divided highway. So once we took those things into consideration, as well as consider the type of user that this client was interested in, which is general manufacturing, light industrial, we felt comfortable advancing this through the process. There's also a utility easement that cuts off that front acreage. So we said that would be great for commercial, stick general manufacturing or light industrial in the back, and you know, these neighbors shouldn't necessarily be detractors for a general manufacturing or light industry. We also want to think about weaknesses, and we want to start eliminating sites based on those weaknesses. So here in this heat map, I'll go ahead and point this out so you can see another site that we identified. This one is 2 landowners, but again, we've got several hundred acres between them, adjacent to a rail line here on the west side. And you can see in the heat map that we get really sparse here just northeast of the site, and that's because this is where town is. So something that we've incorporated into this particular heat map is that we don't want to be in high dense areas. So even if you had a 50-acre parcel that's vacant somewhere within that dense area, it's probably better just to avoid it for a heavy industrial user. So that's why the heat map has not highlighted any of this section, because we probably want to avoid it. So weaknesses that you'll also want to think about and that we've accounted for in our layering of data are things like floodplain, wetlands, steep topography, and so we want to try to stay away from any of those factors. Bedrock, again, those sensitive receptors and neighbors. So as you're going through this process, again, think through what those items are and try to minimize those weaknesses as much as possible. Again, you want to identify a site that's going to be easy for a project to say yes to. I layered on this map here the water and sewer infrastructure surrounding this site. And I think this is an important note for everyone. So we see that primarily, well, especially for smaller communities, water and sewer tend to be some of the biggest limitations for site identification. So as you are thinking through what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, and how you're going to leverage those in identifying the ideal site, think about where your water and sewer infrastructure is and what the capacities are, because it may be that you need to start working through solutions to those utilities either before or at the same time as you're going through the site ID process. So remember, we're talking about this site identification as the inversion of the site selection process. And so at GLS, as we're going through this process of identifying potential sites and then narrowing those down, we are also, in addition to leveraging the heat map and using information gathered from the community, we're also evaluating each potential site through the lens of a site selection project. So that way we can see how each potential site would stack up when compared to one another and make decisions based on where there are strengths, where there are weaknesses that can be overcome within each site. So here you can see on the left side of the screen, I've put up one of our general manufacturing models that, again, we use in our site selection process. And then on the right-hand side, you see the output of that model for one of our site selections or site identification searches. So by looking at the data this way, we're able to identify which sites might be more worth investment, which could be more attractive to the industry that we're trying to target, and where there are gaps that maybe we can overcome. So after we go through, thinking about our strengths, trying to leverage those, thinking about our weaknesses and trying to minimize those specific to our targeted use type, we then reach a point where we recommend that you go through some site-specific due diligence to minimize your risk as a community. We don't want you to get in a situation where you acquire a site, start spending money on a site just to find that there's this huge red flag when you do your ESA phase 1 that is going to eliminate you from most site selection projects. So we first recommend landowner outreach. This is a very delicate piece of the site identification process. It's something that we work closely with our economic development clients to strategize on from the very beginning of the project. But at the very latest, this is the stage where you need to be thinking about reaching out to landowners, because again, you don't want to continue down the pathway of evaluation on a site that is never going to be attainable given the right circumstances. And then secondly, you've got all of the due diligence studies that you eventually will need to check off the list to make sure that there aren't any of those big red flags, fatal flaws specific to your site that would eliminate you from a site selection project. However, due diligence is really expensive. We know that, you're going to have to get most of these studies done before a project will land or as part of the recruitment process. However, in the site identification methodology, we've really enjoyed, and this is where I'm going to turn it back over to Terracon, we've really enjoyed having stage 1 as an option. You'll get to hear a little bit about that, but it provides a low-cost understanding of the likelihood of any of those site-specific fatal flaws that are really important for you as a community or a region to understand before you start spending a lot of money on a site, before you go down the road of acquiring a property or getting a purchase option on the site. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Michael.
Perfect. Thank you, Tess. That was a perfect transition. I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to be here speaking to you today. I also want to thank Joe for that warm introduction. So something that Joe had mentioned, let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. Something that Joe had mentioned is that we both work for Terracon. That means we are predominantly concerned with soils and environmental aspects. So all things that really you can't see until you start drilling holes or digging test pits. What Terracon's done with stage 1 is make a complementary service to what GLS is doing with their site selection. That's how we kind of see these two things marrying together. Tess is correct. I mean, like, site selection involves a lot of criteria and a lot of steps, and it's a process of narrowing sites down from say 100,000 possible sites to a smaller group until you have a small subset of high potential sites. We think stage 1 is simply another tool in the site selector's toolbox that allows them at some point in that process, at some point in that winnowing process, to get a glimpse, get a preliminary understanding of subsurface conditions. And that's critical because, whether you like it or not, what is underlying a site is going to impact eventual construction. So it's better to know earlier in the process. So what I'm showing you now, and hopefully everybody can see, is the application that we built to house all of our historic data. So both Tess and I are really talking about data, leveraging data for the use of site selection. What I'm going to specifically be talking about is our institutional data, data that we as an organization have generated for 50 years by doing everything that we do. Drilling borings, writing geotech reports, doing phase 1s, doing phase 2s, ESAs, you name it. So I am lucky to sit in the Raleigh office, and just for reference, around Raleigh, here's everywhere that Terracon has worked. So each of these red dots represents a historic project, and this might be a project that was done last week, or 5 years ago, or 35 years ago. We still have all of that data. And I've isolated just our geotechnical, and the reason why is because that's where we have boring data, we have subsurface data. So something that Tess kind of touched on earlier was looking for those potential detraction criteria. Things like the presence of shallow rock, things like potential wetlands. That's what this tool is really meant to supplement. We have additional data. We have institutional knowledge about the presence of these red flags, the presence of rock, the presence of potential, collapsible soils, the potential presence of, large environmental concerns. That's what we're building into stage 1. So this is the engine behind that. And what I'll do now is just kind of transition over to show you what one of these things actually looks like. The stage 1 report is still just that. It's still very much a report. It's presented here for demonstration purposes on our client portal. One of the nice things about this is that it gives our clients and their clients access to this information for perpetuity. It doesn't expire. It's not something we charge for. It's also not meant to be a replacement for anything that GLS or anybody else is showing. Uh-oh. Technology, hold on. Okay. Hey Joe, can you see the demonstration stage 1?
I can.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah, Mike. Yep.
Well, I apologize. That was my fault. I must have clicked the wrong little icon in the share tray. So where I was going with this is the platform on which we deliver stage 1s to our clients. And what's nice about this is that it does essentially provide an archive for our clients. They can, access their data as well as the reports today or at any point in the future. It's not like access to this really expires. Let me show you what I mean by trying to leverage our data, our institutional knowledge, to create something that's useful and complementary to everything that Tess kind of lined out. This is what the report essentially looks like. It's about a 15-page PDF, I believe. And this one, let me zoom in just to make it a little bit easier to see. This one specifically is our newest offering that addresses both geotechnical and environmental. Joe was right. I came to the annual conference last year to present stage 1 geotechnical only. One of the first questions that we got when we kind of rolled this out was, that's nice, but when are you going to add environmental? Because that's really what we need, this kind of combined geotechnical and environmental product to really complement site selection and that preliminary due diligence. So we've added environmental, and I'll go through certainly what that entails, what we're looking at. But on the cover of this, what you're going to see is essentially an executive summary. This is just kind of a snapshot of our findings. And it's important to note that we're combining two things here. We're combining two things that are typically separated, geotechnical and environmental, the strength of those subsurface soils and the presence of potential contaminants. The way we do so is we address them differently. From a geotechnical perspective, what we're trying to identify are those red flags that Tess was talking about. Is there anything about this site that's a potential deal killer? Are there shallow rock? Is there, collapsible soil, seismic issues? Is there a fault running across the site? All things that are kind of hidden, things that aren't visibly or apparent if you should walk out to the site and just start looking around. It's very hard to judge the strength of the soils underneath the site just by standing there and looking at it. So from a geotechnical perspective, we're talking about constructability, potential constructability. From an environmental standpoint, we're looking at risk. Now, it's important to note that a stage one and the subsurface environmental and natural cultural resources aspects of a stage one is not a replacement for full due diligence. Like a phase one ESA, once the site has been selected, is still something that will need to occur just for legal reasons, but it's meant to give that glimpse, that preliminary understanding. It's meant to give you an edge. When you're trying to identify the best site or the best sites, which ones are going to be the lowest risk, both for your community as well as your clients. So we've got constructability, and we just decided to go with a ranking system saying, the site's going to be either less suited or better suited, and I'll get into the details here in a second. From a geotechnical perspective, or risk represented as the potential significance here, really is a ranked of low, moderate, or high. In the report, what we get into is everything that we know about the site. Obviously, if this is being done for, say, economic development, we may know very little, and there may be more than one site. This lends itself very well to that kind of comparison of criteria. One thing that we always try to do, and this is critical, is look at previous site usage. We will often go ahead and order what's called the decade aerial package, which oftentimes goes back to the 1930s or 1940s. And what we're looking for on site and adjacent sites is what sort of previous development occurred and what could the implications be for future development. For example, if there was a previous development that perhaps left buried utilities or something online or on site, it's hidden. You wouldn't know it until you get out there and start building, and then all of a sudden it's a large issue. So previous site usage is something we always address. Geotechnical is where we're kind of getting into that data. You may remember the application I showed with all the red dots. We talked about our data. Well, specifically the data I'm talking about are the boring logs that we've created by drilling holes across the nation. So those boring logs represent a tremendously valuable library of subsurface information that we and really only we know to be true. So when we're looking at new sites, what we're doing is aggregating that data to say, we may not have drilled this new site that this community is interested in, but we've drilled all around it. So we have a very good idea of what they're likely to hit. And this is what that essentially represents. This is our understanding of subsurface conditions at a proposed site. What we're always going to tell you is what you're likely to find, as well as how sure we are. And this is based on a number of things. The proximity, the density and quality of our historic data, the consistency of the publicly available data set. This is data that's not specific to us. This is data that everyone has access to, but we can look at it with a very specific eye because we've ground truthed a lot of that through our subsurface borings and ESAs and drilling and so on and so forth. The site ranking just kind of reiterates our opinion of the site. You can kind of imagine how this would be useful, especially if you have multiple sites. Say you've gone through the site selection process with GLS and you've taken a pool of say 100,000 sites and gotten it down to 5. Which is the best? Which is great? Rank them 1 through 5. That's what this really lends itself to. Typically, we're also going to talk about whatever is of concern for that project. For most sites, most building sites anyway, vertical construction, one of the first questions we get asked is, what kind of foundation am I going to be dealing with? Is there potentially shallow rock or any issues that might require blasting or very expensive things like that? that's where we'll talk about that. And it's always specific to that location, that community. These types of reports rely on our institutional data, but they're not produced in a vacuum. We're always writing these stage ones with local experts and professionals in all the various markets that we have offices. So that kind of bleeds over into the site-specific construction considerations. It's meant to be preliminary. This is a desktop study, but it's meant to identify those red flags of issues or potential issues at any given site. So that's the geotechnical portion, and that's kind of a summary of what I showed off last year. This is what's new. So we are also now looking at environmental, and specifically 4 aspects of environmental. Subsurface environmental is dealing with contaminants, pollution, predominantly things in the soil or the subsurface. For subsurface environmental, we are rolling up these 4 kind of subcategories into this overall potential significance. And again, what that's representing is risk. So risk from a subsurface environmental point of view is going to look at physical setting. Is the site a gas station? Site and adjacent property use, is there a gas station next door? We are looking at our historic library of data. This is a little bit different than geotechnical in that environmental is less evergreen to a certain extent. So when we're looking at our own historic data, we're looking at recent historic data and just looking at our own projects to see if there's anything that stands out that may impact development on an adjacent or nearby site. We also are pulling the regulatory database, and this is the same regulatory database that is pulled as part of a phase 1. So it's a great way to kind of get a glimpse, a preview, if you will, of what that due diligence is likely to come back with, should you proceed with that site or sites. Moving on from subsurface environmental, we now get into 3 aspects that kind of get lumped together as natural and cultural resources. Starting with cultural resources, what we're looking for here is really the presence or potential presence of things from a cultural resources perspective. These are mostly things like historical structures, historical districts, grave sites, things like that. We roll all that up into this potential significance or risk from a cultural resources perspective. Wetlands and waters, this is something that Tess touched on earlier. In fact, this was in the traction criteria portion of her slide. So it's certainly something that GLS is looking at, also something that we're looking at here. You can see what we're just trying to do is identify what's the potential risk of wetlands or waters of the US either being present or likely present at any given site. What we're always trying to do is identify, is it present and is it a big deal? Federally protected species, fairly self-explanatory. Is there any critical habitat for any of these species? If they're present or if their habitat is present, what's that going to mean for future development? Could be a big deal, could be not a big deal at all. It just depends on what we find. One nice thing about all of this is that it is a desktop study. It's done very quickly. We don't need access. We don't need to, as Tess so well put it, that delicate negotiation with landowners. Site access isn't necessarily required for this. It's not at all. So these can be done in advance of that landowner conversation. What we also try to do, and this can vary pretty dramatically, is tie it all together. As I said earlier, we're really offering 2 things with stage 1. We're offering geotechnical and environmental. So we're going to try to leverage that to the best of our ability to put forth an efficient plan to move through due diligence. And this is going to vary depending on what we find, depending on how much data we have around the site. But what we're doing here is essentially trying to save you money, because what we don't need to do is re-drill a bunch of borings. Let us tailor this based on what we know from a geotechnical perspective, and environmental is very similar. We're going to tell you what you need to be worried about, and depending on what we find, what that's going to mean for your due diligence process moving forward. So the way we see this kind of marrying up with what GLS is doing is this is in support of the site selection process that GLS is so good at. So it's not really meant to replace any part of what they're doing. It's just meant to complement it. Come in at a point when perhaps we're down to 12 or 15 sites, or maybe 10 or 5 sites, and we need to know all 5 of these sites really meet our criteria. All 5 are generally acceptable for any number of reasons. Now let's get a peek at what's underneath all of these sites and see if there's any issues there. See if there's any red flags or potential issues either from a geotechnical or an environmental perspective. I'll go back to the portal just to, as I kind of wind this down, just to show a couple things. I mean, the stage 1 is a report. It's a report meant to complement site selection and provide our data, our institutional data, to any number of clients that are interested in subsurface conditions at a site, on a site that perhaps we haven't drilled. It is presented here, and what's nice about this is all of that, or a lot of that publicly available data that I talked about earlier, is also available in an interactive map. So if our clients are interested in understanding or better understanding what we're talking about in any given report, they can also visualize all of that information here. You can see that there's a number of layers that we've got turned on, everything from bedrock geology. The depth to rock is critically important. It kind of depends on where in the country you are, whether or not that's likely to be, an issue. But you've also got a lot of issues associated with things like karst or loess, different types of problematic soils or geologic conditions. Corrosion of steel, corrosion of concrete, obviously moving down into the subsurface environmental, cultural resources, and so on. If you want to know what we're talking about when we say you have a fair amount to worry about from a cultural resources perspective, you can read the report, and you can also see it here. And this is interactive, just like GIS is, so you can really interrogate the data further. Regulatory database that I mentioned briefly earlier is also available here. This is that same regulatory database search that you would get in the phase 1. It's just here digitally. So you can see where each of these impacts are, these hits are, in relation to a site or sites, and you can drill down on them and see exactly what they are. Two minutes left. All right, so that's kind of it. That's what we've done to expand our stage 1, our site selection tool, from geotechnical into environmental. We think it's going to be just tremendously useful in that kind of preliminary diligence, pre-diligence phase, to give clients that leg up and really know what to expect. It's all about understanding site conditions sooner and avoiding those late red flags that pop up and everybody thinks, I wish we would have known this earlier. This is meant to be a tool to really kind of combat that. Okay, so I believe I'm going to turn it back over to Josh, and I'm going to stop presenting, and we can open it up for any questions that the audience might have or just general discussion.
Yeah, Tess and Mike, thanks so much for this, for the information. We'd like to take a few minutes for questions. And I've been given some instructions. As a reminder to our attendees, please type your questions into the Q&A box, and I'll add them to the presenter, or I'll ask them to the presenter. So feel free to type into that box, and then we'll take it from there. I'll ask just a general question. Mike, from a geotech standpoint, and this is just a selfish question from me, are there some common items from a geotech standpoint that kind of present a hurdle early on in the geotech process, or what are like the most common issues?
Sure. No, that's a great question. So the red flags that we're usually looking for are things like shallow rock, just because if if a site's going to be developed, you're going to have to deal with that rock if you're, either during site grading or, foundation construction. And the problem is that translates to just a very expensive foundation. So shallow rock typically means just more expensive site development. So to a certain extent, it can be translated straight into money. Is there shallow rock? If so, it's an expensive site. The other thing that we always look at was a couple things, is the presence of what we call high plasticity soils. These are soils that are prone to shrink and swell. And we can't help it, they're just there. But they will have to be dealt with, and dealing with these, remediating these high plasticity soils can be costly. So it's really the same exercise, is are they present? If so, how severely? And then direct translation into what's that mean for my site development cost?
I believe this one is for you, and specific to your tool and maybe some of your comments. Are there specific reasons a neighboring school's a detractor from a site? I guess that might depend on the user, the neighboring user.
Yep, so I can answer that. So that is entirely dependent on the sort of company that you're targeting. So in the example that I showed, we were looking at more of a, general manufacturing sort of use. And our clients, especially as they trend toward even heavier industrial, really prefer not to be right next to schools. It's really more of a perceived risk than an actual risk. But, you can think about if they've got a lot of truck traffic coming in and out, they don't want to think about the liability of, having kids running around. From a community standpoint, we sometimes get pushed back if we're trying to locate or looking at a property next to a school, just from the, again, perception of the community of what the school area in that section of the community looks like compared to the industrial area. But if your targeted user is something like, a high-tech, going to go in a high-tech industrial park, then maybe being located next to a high school is an advantage. So really thinking through what your attractors and detractors are as you start to identify those potential sites is going to be entirely dependent on the type of project that you're recruiting.
Perfect, thank you. One other question, and I think this is maybe getting to some of the economic development organizations' planning perspective, is what should an EDO look like in terms of budgeting? What are maybe the approximate costs, or what should they be thinking in terms of budgets to try to move forward with some of this preliminary due diligence from a site selection standpoint and from a geotech standpoint with some of these new tools?
I can dive in and just, for stage one, what we're trying to create here is something that's very quickly available and very affordable. So for a stage one, like I showed, this is a relatively small site, so it's less than 100 acres. We turn these things around in 5 business days, and we charge less than $2,000. So it's meant to be very attractive in that kind of, initial stages of a project and site selection, because we recognize that budgets are very limited at that point, and it's very difficult to go further than that into more fulsome due diligence, or even, actually drilling a site. That kind of information, while maybe eventually necessary, can derail those initial efforts just because of their costs.
Yeah, and I'll say, one of the reasons why we've been very interested in stage one and sort of watching the progress with the work that Terracon is doing is because we are very sensitive to what we're asking communities to spend on site prep, and due diligence studies are necessary at some point, but they're, you can get up in the several tens of thousands of dollars or more as you start checking those items off the list. Certainly that's part of a site's investment readiness journey, but We've been really interested in stage one as a very reasonably cost option to go ahead and check some of those boxes, minimize some of the risk, give your community confidence to start moving forward with additional investments, to make sure that that's a good investment for you. And then for our clients, again, it just helps us to further minimize risk, so that if we're looking at 2 sites, relatively equal given everything else, but one site has at least some sort of preliminary due diligence and the other has nothing, we're probably going to prefer the site that has some of that preliminary due diligence, because that helps to minimize the risk of the unknown, of what's under the ground that we're not anticipating.
Kind of on the anticipation comment, from global location strategies point of view, when looking at some of this technology and data, have you been surprised as a site selection professional by any of the maybe the initial information that's been provided through that tool, or maybe found something that like the local knowledge of the economic developer, surprised them in their analysis too?
I think, data and data availability is becoming a lot more vital as part of the economic development process. I mean, you all know that competition's getting more and more challenging, as everyone's, continues to invest in their sites. And, you all are probably competing with Virginia, who has the prettiest, I was in economic development in Kentucky. So one of my surprises is, being on the site selection side, is going around the country and seeing what different states have to offer. And Virginia has some of the prettiest sites I've ever seen, just, curb and gutter, infrastructure, all, pulled to the site, ready to go. And so as that competition gets even more stiff, it's just really vital that you think through what data is available to you and how you can leverage that to think like the client. And again, it all goes back to how can you help a company say yes to your site and community. So, I think part of your job is to not be surprised as an economic developer, but that takes going through all of the steps of really knowing the product that you are trying to sell, including, what's under the ground, what the historical uses are, and everything that Michael's talked about.
Thank you, Tess and Michael. I'm not seeing any other questions. I'll wait just a few seconds just to see if anything else comes through, but I do want to thank you both for taking so much time to review this tool with us and to think about the future of economic development and site development in our community.
Hey Josh, just curious, do we have a final slide with Tess and my contact information that we could just kind of have up for anybody in the group that would be interested in following up after the call? If there are any questions about any part of what we presented, I'd be happy to respond.
Great comment. I don't think we have the presenters' information, just their names, up on the screen on the slide, but we will be sure to send out their contact information following this event, along with the video recording to those that registered for the event.
Perfect.
Great.
And that's it for us right at 12. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Bye. Thank you.
Again, I'd like to thank Tess and Mike for their presentation, and Terracon for their support today's webinar. Thank you to NCDA's annual sponsors, the folks we showed earlier today, for their ongoing financial assistance. That concludes today's webinar, and we hope NCDA's members and guests found this discussion valuable. If you participate in NCDA's Emerging Executives Initiative, you will not want to miss the next event, which is a virtual happy hour. Hope you, in COVID-19, you're participating in these sorts of things. That's Thursday afternoon, 4 to 5 p.m. This will take place on the Zoom platform, and attendance is complimentary. Registration details are located on the Emerging Executives page of the NCDA website. If you've never heard of our Emerging Executives program and are intrigued about it, we invite you to learn more The program is designed for younger professionals and NCDA members with fewer than 5 years experience in economic development. If that sounds like you, please join us on Thursday. We'll also soon be sharing details about the 2020 Fall Conference and Site Selectors Summit taking place on October 26th through the 27th virtually. The Conference Planning Committee is working now on a program which promises to be highly valuable. So look for more information soon on that opportunity. In the meantime, stay connected, stay confident, and stay well. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon.